I've had a lot of conversations over the years with blue pill men about red pill ideas. Interestingly, most of them I've talked to have been pretty open to what I was talking about. At least in general terms, my observations about men, women, and the behavior typical to both resonated with them. I've routinely found men nodding agreeably as I described some of their not-so-positive experiences with women in relationship life. They did so even as some of them instinctively glanced over their shoulder, as if to make sure no one was seeing them agree with me. Plenty of them even quietly acceded to my calling them out on their tendency to tolerate abuse, to enable and play white knight in order to stay out of the doghouse. A life spent in some measure of frustration trying to placate an errant child, of jumping through hoops to keep an uneasy peace. It's all common to a lot of men. Sure, some men don't share this experience, and some men claim they don't. You can hear them bragging about how they are in charge of relationships when the woman isn't listening. But most men I've talked to in relationships identify with this to one degree or another. Most of them can chuckle at themselves a little bit when they talk about how they put up with the childish demands and entitled attitudes of their female counterparts. Some of them, without compunction, even cast themselves metaphorically as powerless little schoolboys, fearful of being sent to the principal's office, represented by the disapproval of their wives or girlfriends. They do this with no sense of embarrassment, as though they think all men live this way. And of course, there are plenty of men who do. All this introspective honesty, this good-natured self-disclosure, takes a nosedive, however, when I talk to men as fathers versus just husbands or boyfriends. In that matter, things become, shall we say, pricklier. You see, it's pretty easy for a man to admit that petulant childishness is the default setting for a whole lot of women once they settle into a relationship. Most men will just nod their heads knowingly and shrug it off because in their minds, that's just the way women are. It's quite another matter when you start to talk about the role of fathers in instilling said petulance and childishness. When you acknowledge that daddy's little girl is highly prone to grow up or to just get older and become daddy's little bitch, or much worse. It's quite ironic listening to a man complain about how his wife has crazy, unreal expectations. He bemoans the fact that she cannot be satisfied no matter what he does. He claims that he pulls his hair out trying to figure out how to satisfy her endless demands only to be met with more disapproval and, of course, more demands. He wonders aloud how she ever learned to be such a bottomless pit and such a bitch about it. Then you go watch him interact with his 4-year-old daughter, whom he will endlessly coddle and for whom he will go to any measure to make sure she never lacks anything, no matter how trivial. And it doesn't stop when she turns 5, or 15, or 25. When it comes to turning human females into paragons of pissy entitlement, the Western father has few rivals. I remember well former Vice President Joe Biden talking about being routinely physically abused by his older sister, linked below, informing the world that his parents would have gone nuclear if he had ever defended himself. That was the family rules, and they were not negotiable. The girl got to inflict physical pain on the other children with impunity. The boys got to take it. As Biden recounted, he had the bruises to prove it. My clinical experience informs me that the Bidens weren't by any means the only family who operated on the premise that assault was permissible by girls and self-defense by boys was strictly verboten. Often, the main enforcer of this lopsided affair is the alleged family patriarch. Along with the idea of bodily autonomy for the girl only, is often a whole slew of double standards reflecting the fact that daddy's little girl has daddy wrapped around her little finger. After all, has anyone ever coined a phrase describing how a son has a parent wrapped around his little finger? Of course not, because it largely doesn't happen. The closest thing you'll ever hear to that is the term mama's boy, which is an entirely different story. A mama's boy, which implies blind service to the mother, is a pejorative pointing to the general weakness of the son and the power of the mother. Having daddy wrapped around your little finger or being daddy's little girl implies just the opposite. It is the raw sexual power of the female and the powerlessness of the father, even with the daughter in the state of childhood. She can just crawl into daddy's lap, wrap her little arms around his neck, and get her way every time. He just melts. I will spare us all an analysis of the Freudian implications of that little scenario. It's too gross to go into. Suffice it to say that both family scenarios involve females with power and males without it. Fathers in this regard generally don't take well to a discussion of the subject. I've talked to several of them about enabling dads who treat their little girls like princesses, effectively turning them into cunts who are destined to make a succession of men completely miserable, and who will in the end become miserable themselves. Nobody can hold on to any kind of happiness when chronic, insanely unrealistic expectations are the expected path to get there. That's the curse of modern womanhood. It's why so many of them are miserable and why they feel justified in making others miserable when their plans fall apart. Now, at some point in the conversation with a handful of these fathers, they seem to reach a snapping point. "Wait a minute," they'd say, in a suddenly serious and demanding tone. "You're not talking about me and my daughter, are you?" They weren't kidding. "Why, not at all," I lied, aware that we were getting into dangerous territory. Here I was talking to guys who were so not enabling or overprotective of or unreasonable about their daughters that they looked to be willing to go fisticuffs with a 6'8", 280-pound man if he got too close to the truth. Either that, or they were reacting chivalrously to an imagined slight against their little princess. I'll let you decide which it was. There's a great deal that goes into creating a society of women who feel so entitled to unrealistic demands of men that they make themselves and everyone else suffer. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, feminism has played a huge role. So have obsequious, spineless men, the kind who never met a woman they wouldn't bend over backwards to please. There's also basic biology. Men are driven to scatter seeds, and the greatest majority of them want and need women's permission and approval to do it. That alone has them urging women toward very unrealistic expectations in the long term. Very few men can maintain the lengths they go through to achieve the sexual conquest. We hear women complain about that all the time. And yes, of course, mothers have a lot to do with young girls learning privilege and abusive behavior. That's another talk for another day, though. Almost all my material here is a conversation with men. And as we look at all this from the aerial view, we see that men, in one form or another, are the main culprits. It's entirely arguable that feminists, and women for that matter, are only demanding of men what they know men will ultimately give them, reasonable or not. So in that light, the sole enablers of all this nonsense are men. That includes fathers. Fathers are the first arena where women learn their expectations of men. Fathers are the gateway to hypergamy and gynocentrism. They are women's first lessons in all take, no give relationships. and where they begin to learn the sheer awesomeness of their sexual power. Consider that the next time you see a father walking hand in hand with a little girl wearing a tiara and a t-shirt with the word princess written in glitter across the front. Think of it when you hear a teenage girl gush about all the things her daddy buys for her, or when you hear a father boast that nothing's too good for my little girl, when they would not dream of saying the same about their son. Think about it a little more when you see entire families enable abusive girls, when their relational and other forms of aggression are allowed to flourish at the expense of everyone else, particularly the boys. And if you ever wonder why corrupt, disingenuous ideologies of privilege like feminism are so warmly received by a generation of females who think entitlement is the natural order of things, then take a deeper look at how they got there. If you are looking clearly, you'll see that chivalrous fathers are a big part of the problem. They shape the training ground for feminists and narcissists, and they will indeed get angry, possibly violent, when you call them out on it. So, in most cases, it's better to just let it be. There's nothing to be gained by standing between Daddy and his little nightmare. Life will deliver its own consequences. In closing, I'd like to take a moment to make an appeal to all of you who have supported me on Patreon for so long, but who decided, quite understandably, to withdraw that support in protest of Patreon's censorious conduct. Immediately below, you'll find a link to a donation page on anearformen.com. There you will find options to make one-time and monthly donations, allowing you to support my work without giving Patreon a dime. Your support is important to help me keep this going, and it's greatly appreciated. And that is it for today's talk. As always, I hope you've enjoyed, even if you haven't, and we'll see you next time.